And actually, because we do have a we have a lot of content and now 57 minutes left, I'm going to go ahead and start with the welcoming remarks, and we'll get started. But please do continue to respond to the poll, even if it means you don't listen to me for a few minutes. That's okay. So first, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Zephyr Learning Session on long-range travel demand forecasting under deep uncertainty. My name is Marty Milkovits. I am the Director of Modeling and Analytics at the Boston Region MPO. Flavia Tsang and I will be the moderators for today's session. But before we get started, I want to take a minute and thank Zephyr in particular for providing this platform. And I want special thanks to Amanda Sathopoulos and Shusong Zhou for supporting us through this process and session and nudging us along for, I think, close to 6 months to get this all together. Okay, so I hope you've all had a chance to complete the poll. So I'm going to go ahead and end that, and we'll take a look at the results. And we'll see who had the right answers to these questions. So we have, and I want to apologize first for not including a question like, I don't know, I'm uncertain. Figured it'd be way too tempting for everyone in the audience to respond to that. So we did keep it to defined responses. So it looks like we've got a nice distribution, a lot of public agency, almost a third, well, actually even more than that, close to half of our participants are either modelers or technical managers of public agencies. We've got some students, we have consultants at different levels. A lot of people who have started in the field after 2010, about half. So that's great. I guess the folks that are maybe the most uncertain about what the future might bring. And then looking at, what's our assessment of the state of the practice? Happy to see that there are folks that are very hopeful. More people are very hopeful than not at all hopeful, but we have a nice little bell curve across this. So a nice group for this conversation. And then finally, this kind of aligns with our years of entering the field, a good distribution of years of experience, all from the beginning up to 10 plus. So great, that's the mix we have. And our panelists are furiously developing their presentations to match this exact mix. So I'm just going to speak for another couple of minutes to give them time to do that. And let's get started. So as the title suggests, today's session is focused on long-range planning and particularly the tools that are used to provide quantitative analysis to support a long-range process. Now, this session is a bit different from how our practice of transportation planning and modeling has talked about uncertainty. We're going to focus on the kind of uncertainty that cannot be reduced even with more data, more information, or more sensitive and complex tools. So rather than talking about forecasting accuracy, we'll instead focus on the random component of uncertainty. This is sometimes referred to as aleatory uncertainty, like the uncertainty of the roll of a die. But when we're talking about deep uncertainty, now we're into a space where you don't necessarily know how many sides there are to the die, what's on each side, and anything about the weighting of the die. Now, this kind of uncertainty can be kind of scary, right? Especially when we have a planning process that relies on producing a best guess, maybe most likely, future scenario, and then optimizing the plan against that future scenario, kind of a predict, then act approach. Now, an alternative approach that you're going to hear more about today is decision-making under deep uncertainty. Now, I personally am very excited and interested in this space because I am a modeler. And as a modeler, right, like we want to be building tools that provide better insights to decision makers and ultimately improve the quality of life for our communities. But, I feel kind of uncomfortable, as I'm sure many of you do, when someone takes these projections, a single value out of the model and say, okay, this is the future, this is gospel. They say gospel if they agree with it, it's the devil's music if they don't. But something we're seeing more and more are those kind of articles and commentaries that are really critical of models and modelers, for not doing a good job at predicting that future. So I'm really hopeful that this evolution of our practice, incorporating a deep uncertainty rather than ignoring it, will not only help us support better decisions, but also really help decision makers think of these tools in an appropriate way. This will help us, I believe, focus our efforts not on defending model assumptions and parameters, but on producing better insights, interpreting our tools and those results in a better way, no matter what the actual future might bring. So again, I want to say thank you to Zephyr, Amanda, Shusong, and of course, all of our panelists who my co-moderator, Flavia, will now introduce along with the structure of the session. So I'll pass it to you, Flavia.
Thanks, Marty. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. And today's structure is pretty straightforward. We'll begin with panel presentation, move into moderator-led question, and conclude with audience Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions and comments throughout the session using the Zoom Q&A box. I'll be reviewing the submissions in real time to identify common themes and select representative questions to address at the end. Due to time constraints, we are unlikely to be able to answer every audience question today, but Marty and I are very eager to learn what this community is curious about and what the knowledge gaps lie. So we plan to compile and share all your comments and questions in an email after this meeting. Next slide, please. So today we have an impressive lineup of panelists. First, we have Charlene Rohr, Technical Director at Mott MacDonald. She's based in the United Kingdom. Charlene has over 30 years of experience in developing travel demand models for urban, regional, and national contexts across the UK, the Scandinavia, and Australia. In the last few years, though, Charlene has been working on the future framework for the UK Department for Transport. I personally known Charlene for many years, and here's one of my favorite quotes from her. I have a dream. It is to bring DMDU to transportation. I should say transport because that's what they say in the UK. Today we're very excited to have her sharing her insight into why we need to think about uncertainty and what that means for transportation modeling. Next, joining us is Dr. Rob Lempert, Director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for Longer Range Global Policy and the Future Human Condition at the Rand Corporation. He is also the author of the influential book, Shaping the Next 100 Years, New Methods for Quantitative Longer-Term Policy Analysis. And if that doesn't sound impressive enough to you, here's one more thing that's worth noting. Rob's work contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. I was lucky enough to have had the opportunity to work with Rob while I was at Rand myself, and my favorite quote from him was, "We can act together to shape the future, even when we can't predict the future, what the future will be." Today, Rob will present an example of his work in the transportation sector for the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jeff Newman, who brings over 20 years of experience in developing and applying transportation demand models. He is the lead software developer for TMIP-EMAT, a framework for exploratory modeling using transportation models. He's also the developer for Large, a Python package designed for discrete choice modeling. My favorite quotes from Jeff, with more than 20 years of experience building and using transportation demand model, Jeff has had plenty of time to make a lot of mistakes, but also he's had time to learn from them and to fix a few. Today, Jeff will share his thoughts on whether transportation agencies should invest in DMDU for policymaking. So I would like to thank you to our distinguished panelists for joining us today. We are very excited to dive into today's discussion. So Charlene, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Flavia. I will just try to share my screen. And you can tell me whether you can see that.
All good.
All good? Okay, great. Thank you very much. As Flavia said, my name is Charlene Rohr. I'm a technical director at Mott MacDonald, and I work, I guess, in the place that kind of links transport modeling, policy analysis, and futures thinking. I'm really delighted to be here today to talk to you and to hear what Rob and Jeff have to say after me. And I guess my presentation is maybe a little bit of an introduction about why really we in transport need to be thinking about robust decision making. And I guess I start the talk by just taking a step back and thinking a bit about, we are all aware that transport is part of a very complex system. We often talk about transport as being a derived demand, and it is important to recognize that a number of components of this system are deeply uncertain. Many people have been thinking about uncertainty for a long time, but I think it's really the arrival of this virus, which I'm currently living with. So if there's a lot of coughing, I apologize for that. But it was the arrival of this virus which has illuminated the importance of uncertainty for a lot of people. And with the arrival of COVID, from a transport perspective, what we saw were some significant changes as a result of COVID on transport. We saw significant changes in terms of what we call here digital substitution, that is people working from home, doing meetings like this from home, shopping from home, having medical appointments from home, even doing school from home. We saw a lot of increases in active travel and changes in streetscape. We saw people fearful of crowds impacting public transport demand. We saw changes in employment, which had impacts on the economy. And we saw changes in the way people actually went on holidays and preferring to go having local, more domestic holidays. We're now, I guess, in the kind of medium term post-COVID, where we're asking ourselves, what is the new normal? Will these changes in digital substitution stick? Are people moving back to the office? Are they continuing to work from home? What does that mean for employment and employers? Where are they locating? Do they need offices in city centres? Do they need smaller offices? Do they need bigger offices? Questions about whether public transport demand has recovered. Here in the UK, we're seeing that a lot of demand, the demand for train travel, for example, is about equal to what it was before COVID. But what makes up that demand is quite different. And questions about where people want to live and they want to work. And of course, over the longer term, this will have wider implications in terms of where employers want to locate, the size of offices, where people want to live, public transport demand, impacts on equality, attitudes to health, a wider range of questions, all which impact travel demand. And of course, there's many other uncertainties that have significant impacts on travel demand. If we think about technology, impacts to electric and possibly autonomous vehicles could have really substantial impacts on the cost of travel, on the comfort of travel, on car ownership. Impacts of working from home might have impacts on other activities in terms of shopping, home location, business location, car ownership. Impacts of climate change could have wider impacts on factors that may impact travel, as well as the travel network. And many of these things are really not well represented in our transport models, or they're inputs that have significant impacts on our model predictions. So people who think a lot about uncertainty, and Rob Lempert being one of them, have defined what they call deep uncertainty, which I've put the definition on this slide. And the definition they define as deeply uncertain is a situation in which analysts do not know or cannot agree on the models that relate the key forces that shape the future, the probability distributions of key variables and parameters in these models, or the value of alternative outcomes. And I think if you were to ask the people in this audience, When do they think autonomous vehicles will arrive? What will be the cost of travel? What will it do to the transport system? I think you would find that a lot of people wouldn't agree about that. And I think that that puts us in the definition of an environment that's deeply uncertain, or certainly one example of being deeply uncertain. And this book, Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty, is really helpful to think about uncertainty. I sort of think of it as the Bible of uncertainty analysis. And importantly, for people who aren't aware about it, it's free to download. So I encourage you to do so. And if you look at this book, you'll see that the experts in these methods for decision making under deep uncertainty associate uncertainty with different aspects of the system of interest. And these map really well to transport models. So they talk about uncertainty in the world outside the system, which we think about as the exogenous variables that are inputs to our transport models, things like GDP growth, cost of travel, impacts of new technologies. They talk about uncertainty in the decision domain or the model system itself. They talk about uncertainty in the outcomes of the system, and they talk about uncertainty in the importance placed on these outcomes, which we would codify in our appraisal process. So things like maybe values of travel time saving or the value of carbon, etc. They also give us guidance about different levels of uncertainties and their implications for how we approach modeling and analysis. So this graph from the book defines a sort of a continuum of uncertainty from completely deterministic on the left to highly, deeply uncertain, or called total ignorance even, on the right. So if you're looking through this across this continuum, you can see for level 1, you have a very deterministic model system where you might be making a point estimate prediction for a specific outcome with a single set of weights. In level 2, you might have a stochastic system model. You might be looking at confidence intervals for different outcomes and several sets of weights. And as you're moving through to level 3, where you're having a few plausible futures, we're finally arriving in level 4, where we have many plausible futures, many different systems model, wide ranges of outcomes, and a wide range of weights. I would argue that transport models largely adopt level 1 or 2 or level 2 approaches. So our models are deterministic or maybe probabilistic. We often make point predictions, point estimate predictions, very rarely with confidence intervals, I'd say, for a single future, perhaps with some sensitivity testing. We generally assume the same behavioral mechanisms in the future as exists today and use projections of key inputs derived from past trends. We also assume the same weights broadly apply in future in appraisal, although we may change values at time, for example, as a result of income change predictions. But I'd argue, and I tried to, I guess, argue in the first few slides, that we live in this deeply uncertain world. There is substantial uncertainty in the exogenous inputs to our models. We don't completely understand the system model or represent all interaction, for example, in terms of supply or changes in attitudes or behavior. Assumptions about these will generate different system outcomes, and we may not agree on the weights that we put on different outcomes now or in future. If you accept that we can't predict the future because the future is uncertain, and if you accept that what we do as transport planners actually influences the future, and if you accept that we need to make substantial change because of the world that we live in, then I think that you may accept that we need to adopt a different way of planning and modeling. And here in the UK, we tend to call this decide and provide. And when we say decide and provide, what we are talking about here is a different way of planning, which involves the following 5 steps. It says, because we can't predict the future, we have to actually think about what are the outcomes that we want. What's the vision that we're aiming for and potential ways to get there. Second, if we've set out our vision and the ways to get there, we need to understand what are future risks and uncertainties and make sure that our proposed policy and investment pathways are robust across a wide range of future conditions. We need to understand what things we need to do now to help shape the future. We need to understand the things that we might need to do to mitigate against future risks, and we need to monitor for future risks and uncertainties and continually review our plans. We need to design and invest in policies that are robust, and I think that we're going to hear that word a lot today, are robust across a wide range of futures. So something that was picked up in the introduction then is, what's the difference between what we call predict and provide? I think someone called it predict and act, and a decide and provide approach. So as I see it, the predict and provide approach is one where you would run your model for future years and predict the future demand and conditions. You'd have a look, identify challenges. You'd think about what policies and interventions you might need to implement to solve these challenges, and you would appraise these and choose the ones that are optimal, an optimal solution given the conditions that you've predicted. In a decide and provide environment, we think about it the other way around, as I described earlier. It's really about thinking about what are you trying to aim for, what kind of outcomes do you want, what options would you have to get there. We'd think about plausible future scenarios about how the world may play out, and then test these policies and strategies to reach your vision across these different scenarios. Instead of choosing optimal solutions, we would choose those ones that are robust across a range of scenarios. And we would want to be thinking about mitigation actions that we might have to take if certain future challenges play out. We'd think about the conditions and signals that we would be looking for that would determine when we'd hit those sorts of conditions, when we'd need our mitigating actions. And I think in the decide and provide approach, we would recognize that what we do shapes the outcomes of our system. Models are needed in both of these approaches, but in the predict and provide approach, you'd be making your plans based on your model predictions, whereas in the decide and provide approach, you're really using your model to stress test your plans. The use of scenarios is a key part of the decide and provide approach, and scenarios are, views of the future that are constructed to reflect key future uncertainties, and importantly, I think, the interactions between those uncertainties. Developing scenarios can help policymakers think about future uncertainties, about challenges that may negatively impact the success of their plans, but also about opportunities that may increase the success of those. They're used to develop and test policy and investment plans, leading to more robust plans. And scenarios are being used more and more in the UK to test investment and policy plans. And in fact, the UK Department for Transport has published a set of what they call their 7 common analytical scenarios, which they are asking people, analysts, to use in appraisal of large-scale investments. So they're asking people to think about how robust their plans are across these different scenarios when they're doing appraisal of different investments. But the use of scenarios also comes with challenges. The analyst is having to make assumptions about what they think are the key uncertainties and what they think and how they think those may evolve. And of course, we may be wrong about those, or we may underestimate the range of how they may develop in future. Often people limit the number of uncertainties considered in the scenarios, because if you're developing these scenarios, you can see how they soon kind of mushroom out of control as you have more and more potential combinations of uncertainties and the values that they may take. And there's a tendency to stay close to kind of business as usual situations, which can limit their effectiveness. when I was working at RAND, one of my colleagues, Stephen, I thought really summed it up well when he said, you know, scenarios founder on the same shoals, really an inability to grapple with the long-term's multiplicity of plausible futures. So that's where decision-making under deep uncertainty methods come to the fore. And robust decision-making that Rob's going to talk a lot more about is one method that incorporates the idea of scenarios, thinking, robust decision criteria, stress testing, the use of exploratory models, visualization, and high-power computing. And the 3 steps in the robust decision-making approach are shown on the right of the slide. And they really map really well to the decide and provide approach that we also adopt, where the first step is really the framing step, where you're thinking about what are your objectives, what are you aiming for, and identifying potential policies to reach your goals. The second step is around exploration and specifying uncertainties and using models to explore outcomes of policies and really to understand their vulnerabilities and opportunities. And thirdly, really understanding when you do that scenarios analysis, under what conditions do your policies work? Under what conditions do they fail? What risks and trade-offs are you making between different outcomes? And then you're selecting a plan for adoption and a plan for monitoring. And of course, you might have to go through this loop a couple of times. I'm going to finish by saying that exploratory modeling is a key part of this process, and it's used to systematically explore the consequences of uncertainties on policy decisions across a wide range of outcomes. You can stress test your policy plans over a much larger set of future conditions, and it's really the systematic analysis of the outcomes that can help us and decision makers understand when their policies work and when they do not, and to think about ways to either strengthen those policies or to make mitigation plans. So I finished by saying, you know, because our models can't predict the future, it doesn't mean that we don't need those models. Of course, they are going to be an important part of the process of how we plan. I see our travel demand models as really a treasure trove of the complex understanding of travel behavior. But really, we can't fool ourselves that our models can predict the future. It's just impossible to predict the future. If COVID has taught us anything, it's that we cannot predict the future. But they can help us understand what are the potential impacts of policies across a wide range of futures. And they can really help us to understand what policies will work well across that range of futures and under what conditions they may fail. So I believe they're a key part of our analysis toolkit for planning. But to stress test future plans, I also believe that our models need to evolve and that we will need faster running and maybe less precise models to support the thinking and planning that needs to happen for the longer term. So I look forward to hearing more from Rob and Jeff, and to say thanks for listening.
Great. Flavia, should I share my slides and go?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Can you see my slides?
Looks good.
Great, good. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here with you all. I'm Rob Lempert, and I'm going to give you an example of the sort of analysis that Charlene and Marty have been talking about and set up Jeff's discussion. So let me dive in. I'm going to start with just a couple of slides to retell the story that Charlene just told you, to introduce some of the words that we use. But traditional policy analysis, and this includes much of the way that transportation planners use models and analysis, begins with this idea of a consensus understanding of the future. So we ask, what will future conditions be? And in practice, this is often a point forecast or a most likely future. If one is doing it, sort of in the way the full theory suggests, you have a joint probability distribution over all future states of the world. But we have this idea of a future. Then we can use that consensus understanding of the future to rank different options. We have some sort of utility or payoff function, some set of objectives that tell us what is a better or worse strategy given our attained future. And then we might do some sensitivity analysis to see how sensitive it is to what uncertainties we may have. And this is a tremendously useful set of tools which underlies, and it's got a firm theoretical foundation, and it's used across many, many different areas. And we give it the name predict, then act, because it is all contingent. The answers you get out are contingent on this consensus understanding of the future. So in many, many problems, in many, many cases, predict and act is exactly what you want to do. I always say you would never get on an airplane where the people who built it and who fly it don't work very well in this predict then act regime. But there's a whole class of problems captured by this idea of deep uncertainty where predict then act can break down. And so what becomes a prediction can become tunnel vision. And so under conditions of deep uncertainty, there's real pressure to underestimate the uncertainties, because if you admit, say, to the board or the public, how much is uncertain, they don't listen to you. Competing analysis contribute to gridlock. People may not like the plans that are recommended by a set of predictions, but it's easier to attack the predictions, which are virtually certain to be wrong, than debate the pros and cons of the plan. And then this perhaps more subtle point that we have a tremendous amount of information, both in our models and in our heads, in our organization, which can be used to come up with innovative, creative plans that are in fact robust and resilient in the face of uncertainty, and forever trying to make our predictions better and better is often a fruitless task that distracts from this more important approach. So here's a definition of deep uncertainty, which is pretty similar to the wording that and identical in idea that Charlene showed. But when parties to a decision do not know or do not agree on the likelihood of alternative futures or how actions are related to consequences as mediated through our models. Okay, so if you're not going to do predict and act, what do you do? And one way to think of this is we're going to do the analysis backwards. So instead of starting with a consensus understanding of the future, we start with what future we would like to have and what are our current plans for getting there. So strategy and goals and decision context. We use our analytics to answer questions such as to stress test our plans and answer questions such as what would the future have to be like in order, what would have to happen, what are the key conditions that make our plans consistent with our goals, and what are the futures in which our plans are inconsistent with our goals. And it turns out that that sort of question can often give us a much more high confidence answer than trying to start with predictions. And I'll give you an example of that. And once we have a sense of the types of futures in which our plans are consistent with our goals and not, we can start thinking about how we might modify plans or choose new ones to increase the range of futures in which plans are consistent with goals. So Charlene talked a bit about the book on the left, Decision-Making or Deep Uncertainty, which is a large volume intended for a broad audience. So free online, definitely you should get that. And it gives you a sense of both the concept here, the theory, and the many ways it's been put into practice. On the right is a shorter document by U.S. Federal Highways, which tries to condense many of these ideas down with a particular focus on the transportation sector. And then I've been talking broadly about this idea of decision-making, deep uncertainty. I'm going to focus now on a particular flavor of this activity called robust decision-making. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example now of what this looks like in practice. And this is some work we did a couple of years ago for the Sacramento Council of Governments, SACOG, and asked them, asked the extent to which their then current plan was consistent with its goals. And SACOG was a great group to work with, both very innovative and eager to try new things. But they also have, the common challenges of many transportation planners of, uncertain demand, particularly even more uncertain because of the aftermath of the pandemic, all the technology shocks coming down the path. But they're also in California, which has very aggressive climate decarbonization goals. So they had to add that to their uncertainty mix. So we helped them look at their 2016 plan as input to their planning cycle they completed a couple of years ago. They have a regional transportation plan, sustainable community strategy. It aimed to meet, it had a whole bunch of goals. We focused on its climate greenhouse gas reduction goals and its mobility and equity goals. And so it had a plan with many, many actions. And we then used RDM to stress test this plan over a wide range of futures. And in this analysis, one of the challenges here, and Jeff will talk more about this, is that the travel demand and other models often used in the transportation sector are very, very large and detailed and are a challenge to over many, many futures. So in this demonstration example for SACOG, we basically used a very simple essentially a set of equations based on cohorts to interpolate and extrapolate among a much smaller number of runs of the travel demand model. Okay, so I showed you the bubble diagram on the previous slide. I've now turned into a checklist of steps in the RDM process. So first we do a decision framing. What are we trying to achieve? What actions might we take to achieve our goals? What uncertainties do we worry about? I'll show you a representation of that in a second. Then we're going to stress test the strategies and ask, what are the key combinations of factors that best distinguish futures in which we meet from where we miss our goals? And then how do we use that in information to identify new or revised strategies? So let's start with step one. Okay, so Charlene had a slide where she talked about these uncertainties, policy levers, performance metrics, relationships. We often find it's very useful in engaging with the public in having a discussion about posed by a question. In this case, can SACOG meet its aggressive climate goals? And then starting to organize what people talk about into these four categories and putting into this 2x2 matrix. And so one is, what are decision makers trying to achieve? What actions are they considering to get to those goals? What uncertain factors outside the decision makers' controls, exogenous factors, affect their ability to pursue their goals? And then how do we map a set of plans, a particular future as a particular instantiation of the uncertainties on to the performance metrics we're concerned about, and this is essentially our model. So in this SACOG study, we had four performance metrics, total greenhouse gas emissions in 2035. California has a particular accounting system laid out in Senate Bill 375, which focus their attention on a subset of greenhouse gas emissions, which are largely focused on land use questions. So those two numbers are similar in some scenarios and very different in others. And then mobility and equity here is just a relatively simple metric, which is just mobility for certain cohorts, low-income cohorts of people. Whole set of uncertainties that essentially had point estimates by the time SACOG got around to developing their plan. Oh, I should say we're stress testing a base case policy, the 2016 travel plan. And then we looked at a variety of response options once we identified vulnerabilities. A large number of uncertain factors, gas prices, what happens with zero electric vehicles, fuel economy of internal combustion engines, the rate of economic growth, the extent to which travel behavior among the younger cohorts changed or stayed constant as those cohorts aged, and various elasticities, and then this simple model, which was essentially an interpolation and extrapolation machine from the larger travel demand model. And again, Jeff will talk about a way to relax that rather significant constraint in his talk. Okay, so now let's use this machinery and this framing to test the SACOG plan. Okay, so we begin by running the model over a very large number of future cases, and where each of these futures is one instantiation of those many uncertainties. So one value for gas prices, one value for fuel efficiency, one value for each of the elasticities, et cetera. We did 10,000 cases. You get this large sea of points. We looked at all four of our metrics, and so I'm showing you here a 2x2 projection. So I'm showing you total greenhouse gas emissions as a function of mobility. Each of these dots is one model, one of the future, and I've colored them green and gray. A green dot is where SACOG meets all four of the goals we're considering. It's mobility, equity, and the two types of climate goals. And a gray dot is it misses one or more goals. So not surprisingly, you get green dots when you've got high mobility and low emissions, though there's some mixing in that corner of green and gray because some of the dots with high mobility and low greenhouse gas emissions fail on either the SB 375 bill accounting for greenhouse gas emissions or fail on equity grounds. So the first conclusion from this big cloud is that SACOG's plan meets its goals under some conditions and not others. But a much more useful question is, okay, what characterizes a green dot versus a gray dot? What are the key factors which give you a green dot versus a gray dot? So to do that, we run what we call scenario discovery classification algorithms. Essentially, we run algorithms over the database, try to come up, maximize coverage density so to maximize the ability to distinguish a green and a gray dot, and do so with the fewest parameters as possible to maximize the ability of people to interpret the results. And so this is what you get on the right. So each one of these bars is one of the uncertainty, where I've got the bar divided into green and gray. It turns out that those combinations of parameters are most powerful, most effective, most important in distinguishing a green and a gray dot, or whether SACOG meets and misses its goals. The bars for which there's nothing are ones that are it turns out that those uncertainties are much less important in determining whether SACOG meets and misses its goals. And so if you look at the range of green for gas prices, fuel efficiency, employment growth, and the sensitivity of vehicle mile travel to the cost of driving, if the future world in 2035 is such that gas prices are in the range of the green bar, fuel efficiency is the range of the green bar, et cetera, for the other two, you have a very high likelihood of meeting its goals. You get a green dot. Otherwise, you're virtually certain to get a gray dot. And so this tells us what the conditions for success of SACOG meeting its goals are. And conversely, it gives us various scenarios under which SACOG would fail to meet. And so I label here a couple that were particular interests in going forward in the planning process. If gas prices are too high, SACOG's going to miss their goals. If fuel efficiency is too low, they'll miss their goals. And if employment growth is too high, they will also miss their goals. The little purple turquoise lines going up and down are the point case that point estimate that SACOG used in setting up its plans. And so you see something which is often pretty common when you do this sort of thing, is at least some of the SACOG assumptions are right at the edge of a cliff, particularly gas prices. So gas prices are just teensy bit higher than assumed, the plan fails. And this happens because the agency is working really hard to manage a whole bunch of trade-offs. And so once it's fixed a particular future in its mind, it often ends up right next to a cliff on sensitivity to one or more of the assumptions, because it's working so hard to balance the trade-offs within space it's created for itself. Okay, so this is essentially a stress test of SACOG's plans. The plan succeeds if the future turns out within those green bars, and it doesn't if it doesn't. So this is a very valuable information to take forward in the planning. We did just a little bit in terms of what are new and revised strategies. So let me talk about that very specifically, SACOG, and give you some more general comments and then close. So we looked at a variety of policies, and we were limited here by this very simple cohort model we were using. But I'm showing you here looking at what happens if SACOG took action to increase electric vehicle penetration. You're putting out more chargers, that sort of thing. And it does, and then I show you what happens for each of the goals. And it not surprisingly does a lot for the greenhouse gas emission goals. It does a little bit for the other goals. And this was actually really useful information for them in going back and talking to the regulators, for whom the way that they were accounting what SACOG doing didn't account for this sort of policy at all. So this allowed them to open up the space a little bit with the regulators about what counted as an important action or not. Let me generalize the discussion a little bit and go in the direction where this sort of work really needs to go in the transport section. Is robust strategies, ones that work well over a wide range of futures, are often designed to adapt over time in response to new information. And Charlene was talking a lot about that. Here's a couple of definitions of robust strategies. And the way you make them adaptive, a good way to think about this is when you have a bunch of scenarios. We have near-term actions, which is going to be defined in the plan. Then the plan also defines signposts, which are early indicators that we're heading to one scenario or another. And then associated with each signpost is a contingent action. If we see this, that suggests we're heading off, for instance, a scenario A, what would you do? If you saw a signpost that suggests we're going to scenario A, what would you do? So this is, I think, an important frontier for applying these ideas to transportation. Jeff's going to talk about modeling capabilities that might let us do that. The stress tests are very powerful in forming the signposts. And let me just, since I don't have a good example of this in the transportation sector, let me show you a very well worked out version. In this case, the coastal protection sector. But the river, the UK has built the Thames River Barrier, which is meant to protect London from storm surge. And it's much laid out in this adaptive strategy, where the main uncertainty they're looking at, deep uncertainty they're looking at, is the amount of sea level rise. And not to go through this slide in great detail, but the basic idea is it begins with a particular set of infrastructure and an associated flood management actions up and down the Thames coastline. And then it's got very well what sea level rise observations would trigger either new infrastructure investments or new land use or new response options. And so the agencies have worked out with all the stakeholders in an accountable, a predictable way how this flood control infrastructure and surrounding policies will respond over the course of the coming century to a whole variety, to this deeply uncertain, unpredictable rate of sea level rise. So just to close,
Yeah, okay.
RDM and
We
DMDU.
have about 6 minutes left, but I'm hearing that some of the panelists can stay for longer, so we'll try to extend the session by 15 minutes.
Sorry for going too long. Just one last slide.
Sorry to interrupt.
Basic principles: plan for multiple futures, seek robust plans, perform well over many futures, make your plans flexible, adaptive. So rather than predict and act, plan over multiple futures. And in the lower right, seek certainty in your decision, not in your prediction, which is a key idea here. So thank you very much.
And our next speaker is Jeff Newman. Jeff, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
Oh, I need to stop sharing.
Okay.
There we go.
I'm going to assume you could see it. Shout if you can't. So
Yes.
I'm going to also try to go very fast because I want to leave as much time for questions as possible. So I'm going to go through my talk really quick. And Rob promised I was going to talk about a lot of stuff. I'm not going to talk about everything Rob said I'm going to talk about. But the question that I'm going to address is, should my agency, I'm going to put myself in the shoes of a public agency, should my agency invest in DMDU tools? We heard from Charlene and Rob, the real world is deeply uncertain, and we need a better approach to deal with this uncertainty. And my response to that is, no, that is not what is required for my public agency. My public agency has to do things that are required by law or statute or other regulations. And DMDU is almost everywhere in the world not required. So we don't need to do it. And for a lot of agencies, it just looks like this is another thing that we need to do and comes without any more money to do it. So my question then is, should we do this even though we don't have to? And how do we think about whether or not we should use DMDU tools in planning? And there's a lot of uncertainty of whether changing our decision-making process is actually going to be valuable. Are the people that we're working with, are my stakeholders going to support this new way of thinking about how to do planning? How much is it going to cost for us to do all this extra work? How are we even going to know that it's useful? And I'm going to say, this looks a lot like that 2x2 matrix that Rob pointed out. We can think about doing DMDU, and we can use these tools to decide whether we should be using these tools. So this is a slide that reviews the framework Rob went over. But what in general characterizes making good decisions under DMDU are decisions that are robust, which means it's a good decision no matter what the future holds, or most of the time, and decisions that are adaptive that allow us to change what we're doing in response to feedback that we get from the system. And so my take on DMDU, after having done this a few times for a few different agencies, is that the benefits from using DMDU tools are not all about deep uncertainty. There's all of this, everything that Charlene and Rob talked about how to do planning and how to do it better, and dealing with uncertainty in our forecasts. But when you make the switch to thinking about processes like that and using our quantitative models to think about deep uncertainty, there are also benefits that accrue back to those statutorily required tasks. And so pushing through the models and using exploratory modeling approaches and having many scenarios and thinking about all of this uncertainty makes the model better for DMDU type planning, but it also makes the tools better for predict then act, which if that ends up being the way that decisions still get made for some agencies in some places, it's still worth the effort to push towards the DMDU process, even if you don't think you're going to get there, which makes this a robust solution. Some of the practical experience that I have found in working with EMAT in particular, which we built to do exploratory modeling and take existing transportation models and run them much more rigorously and in an exploratory fashion. By using EMAT, we're forcing agencies to ask questions about their models. Well, we're making people think about what can we do with the models that we have? How do we represent the future? What is coming out of the model? And do we actually want to measure the things that are coming out of the model? Or is it just like, this is the stuff that came out of the model, but these aren't the goals that we're actually focused on? Are we focused on VMT? Are we focused on climate emissions? Are we focused on delivering mobility and providing quality of life for citizens? And the process of going through all of this decision making actually helps focus our decision making process on what are actually the outcomes that we care about as opposed to the outcomes that we get. We can also ask questions about the questions. Are we asking the right questions? Are we too focused on this is what our model is and not focused enough on this is what our policy goals are? And lastly, the process provides us a great opportunity to do really rigorous testing on models. Are observed elasticities reasonable? Are the inputs easy to manipulate or to break? Are the outputs being saved correctly? Just like the technical process of working with the model. And by pushing the limits of the model, we're also pushing the technological computational limits of the tools and making sure that they're working the way that we expect. When we go to do our predictions, when we go to do our scenario analysis, the other thing that I have found in practice is interpolation is much more reliable than extrapolation, and especially when applied to transportation planning tools. All of our model estimation, validation, calibration on transport models is generally done with observed data. What did we see people do? What did they, how did they travel? What trains did they use? What highways did they use? But with the gas prices that were there, with the transit fare policies that were in place. And there's only a limited amount of variance in the real world so far. And COVID's actually given us a little bit more variance, but it's still really hard to extrapolate out what happens if gas prices become $5, $6, $7, $8, $20 a gallon. We have really no idea what happens at $20 a gallon. And if you feed this into a mathematical model, there is a lot of extrapolation that is going on, and the results of the model tend to get weird. We've seen I've pushed the limits on dynamic traffic assignment models and ended up where population forecasts that grow a little bit too fast cause millions of people to just be out on the roads in the middle of the night and their trips never end because the model just mathematically is not capable of meeting the level of demand that we push through it. And so we can't go quite that far with the model that we have. And that gives us the opportunity to ask the question, how far can we go with the models that we have? And do we need to invest in something slightly different computationally, analytically, in order to answer questions that may be outside the realm of what our models can handle? So my key takeaway here is that there is a lot of value from adopting the DMDU approach and really giving the analytical methods the time and effort and pushing them the way that we can with DMDU. And even if we never used this, even if we're still our agencies, our governments are still stuck in predict then act, we can make the process better and deliver a better predict then act solution with the DMDU process and using exploratory modeling and trying to push towards robust modeling, even if we don't get there. And hopefully, I said in my slides from before, hopefully there's time for questions. We are 3 minutes over, but we've extended for 15, so there is time for questions. Hooray!
Yay, thank you so much, Jeff, Rob, and Charlene. So Marty and I decided that we'll just skip the moderator-led question, but go straight to audience question. And we may only have enough time for one. So let's try this one from ZV. Well, it's mostly a comment, but there's a question embedded within it. He said, many years ago at TRB, I attended a workshop about moving theory into practice. And we had a politician come talk to us about his perspective and role in the process. Essentially, he said that his job is to make decision, and a decision is yes or no. If our model produce results which say maybe this, maybe that, what is he supposed to do with that? I would like to hear our panelists' reaction to this comment / question. Charlene, would you like to go first? Or Rob or Jeff?
I mean, I'll dive in if you like. I mean, I think the politician is actually misstating his or her role a little bit. We could discuss why they say that, but actually politicians spend an awful lot of time trying to frame and organize, what the decision is and what their choices are. So, and eventually you get to a yes or no, but there's, a lot of work before then to put together about what you're saying yes or no to. So that Thames River barrier case, where the question is not what the not what the flood management and infrastructure and policies around London ought to be in 2100, but is rather, should we approve this plan which does this over the next 20 years, monitors this, and then does this or that depending on what we see? That's the thing you say yes or no to. And the models can help come up with a plan which has that character. And, if you look across a whole bunch of sectors, I mean, plans are meant to be flexible and things like that. And certainly, one of the raps on politicians is they spend way too much time trying to be super flexible. Anyway, it goes back to this idea that your certainty's in the plan and not the projection.
Thank you very much. Anyone else who would like to jump in?
I would say to the politician, it's your job, once you've done all that framing that Rob talked about, and boil it down and yes, you get to, your job is to decide yes or no, do a thing. And the analysts and the tools and all of this work that we've put in beforehand is not here to tell you what the right choice is. It's here to provide you with the feedback on what are the risks and what are the rewards, and how you weigh those things. That's for the politician to decide. And getting to the right framing and getting a right understanding, the best possible understanding of what could go right and what could go wrong with when you say yes or when you say no. I think that's the essence of decision making under uncertainty, is that there's always going to be uncertainty. And so coming up with the plan and being able to get to the question of yes or no
Right.
about what are you going to do and how, like, yes or no on what, long before that, like, what is the plan, and do we invest in this? Like, once you lay down track for a train, then the track is there, and that's a pretty long-term decision, but maybe you can run a bus, or maybe you can do other things, and coming up with alternatives that have different consequences gives and using the tools to come up with those alternatives is what DMDU is all about.
Thank you. So seek certainty in the decision, not in the predictions. Any more thoughts from the panel on this question? Yes, Charlene.
Well, I guess I agree with everything that Rob and Jeff has said. And I just think if I were a politician, I would want to be armed with the tools that were able to say, when someone said to me, explain why you think it's a good decision, I could say, you know what, it works really well for most of the things that we could imagine could go wrong. And if we find that we're in a situation where, you know, it doesn't look like the conditions are conducive to this sort of policy, we know exactly what we would do in that case to make sure that it works, as opposed to the politician who's going to go into a discussion that says, I think this is a good decision based on the one future scenario we've considered. And the other person says, well, what happens if 30% of the people continue to work from home? Have you thought about that? And they have to say, well, no, that's not in our model. We didn't actually consider that. Or what about the situation where gas prices are X? And they have to say, well, no, we didn't consider that because we've assumed that gas prices are Y. Or, so I think that the point is that the approach gives the decision maker much more power in understanding why theirs is a good decision and in what cases it might be vulnerable. And I would rather have that information if I was a decision maker.
Thank you very much, Charlene, Rob, and Jeff. I think I'm going to pass the floor back to Marty to wrap up.
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone. Thinking about this, I think this is going to be a really foundational resource for our community as we do, embark into this new practice. And I really appreciate all our panelists, Charlene, Rob, Jeff, wonderful presentations. As Flavia mentioned earlier, we're going to be wrapping up all the comments from the audience, and some great comments in there. These will be shared with the panelists as well as included in the materials from this learning session. So just to have a quick wrap, I'm going to put up, if I can find my screen share. If you'd like to, learn more about uncertainty, stay in touch with this community as it develops, there are opportunities. If you're going to the TRB annual meeting in 2 months, we will have a workshop on Thursday morning. So please extend your stay through Thursday. We're calling it Future Uncertain. And so in this workshop, you've heard a lot about decision-making under deep uncertainty. You will have the opportunity to actually have a firsthand experience of making decisions under deep uncertainty. You'll stare into that abyss through an interactive game that Flavia is going to run for us. But don't worry, we're going to have an expert panel of people to help you navigate the abyss. We have Tara Widener from ODOT to give us the perspective on the public sector. We have consultants, Rachel Copperman, who's done many deployments of TMIP EMAT, and Naomi Stein, who is leading up the NCRTP study into incorporating uncertainty for long-range plans. We have a couple folks from the academic side, Pratik Bansal, who is advancing and building better tools to explore this, and also Chandra Bhatt, who will be giving us kind of that bigger picture and big directions on how the practice will evolve. So they're all there to to get you through it. And Flavia tells me that the survival rate from this game is quite high. So it'll be an exhilarating experience. I also want to highlight a DMDU initiative that's being promoted through the TRB Travel Forecasting Committee. There's a website linked here, TRB Travel Forecasting/DMDU. A lot of resources there from workshops and other references that please you can avail yourself of. But also we have a mailing list where events like this will be promoted. And we have been doing a practice of a book club where we pick a piece of research, recent publication. We actually recently worked through the transportation planning for uncertain times that Rob and others worked on for FHWA. So really looking forward to keeping that going, a nice discussion, getting into it. So with that, thanks for everyone for taking the time to attend. Thanks again to our panelists, Charlene, Rob, and Jeff. Thanks to Zephyr and Flavia and I. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Please take a moment to answer the exit poll with a couple of questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks.